Okay, welcome everyone. Tonight it's my pleasure on behalf of the Education Committee of Pennsylvania Society of Ornithology to introduce tonight's speaker. Our topic, as you can see on the big screen, is Why Are Tree Swallows Stressed by Jenn Houtz. And a bird's ability to cope with and recover from ecological stressors, such as extreme temperatures, can influence survival. Wild birds can respond to stressful events by upregulating hormone levels. Our speaker, Jenn Houtz, will share results from her doctoral work on tree swallows' stress physiology and general tips for attracting cavity nesting birds to your backyard. Dr. Jennifer Houtz is an assistant professor in the Department of Biology at Allegheny College. She received her Ph.D. in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from Cornell University, where she studied gut microbiomes and stress physiology in tree swallows. She received her Bachelor of Science in Animal Behavior from Millersville University, where she studied the social structure of wire-tailed manakins in Ecuador. As the faculty advisor of the Allegheny College Bird Club, Jennifer is passionate about involving undergraduate students in ornithological research and outreach. Thank you so much, Jenn, for being here and telling us about tree swallows' lives. Please take it away.
Thanks, Joe, for that wonderful introduction. So again, I'm Dr. Jenn Houtz, and today I'm going to tell you about why are tree swallows stressed? And hopefully we'll have an answer to that question by the end of the talk. So I first like to give a little background about how I became an ornithologist. So I'm from Pennsylvania and from a small town called Mifflintown. And I really had no interest in birds growing up. I knew I wanted to be a biologist, but as maybe some of us who were in high school, and if you're good at biology in high school and you like it, you're told to become a medical doctor. So when it came time to choose where to go to college, I'm the first person in my family to go to college. So it came down to financials and proximity to home. So I chose to go to Millersville University in Lancaster. And there I started off pre-med, but then quickly realized that that was not the right path. And then my biology 101 professor happened to study birds and was looking for a research assistant to take to Ecuador during winter break of my freshman year. So I jumped on that opportunity because I had never been out of the country before. And then I got to go to the Ecuadorian Amazon, where I studied the social behavior of wire-tailed manakins. So once you hold a wild bird, especially this beautiful male manakin here, you can't really choose a career path. So then I came back to Millersville, switched into the animal behavior track, and then knew that I wanted to eventually become a professor where I could do both teaching and research. So I did my PhD at Cornell in the lab of ornithology, and there I worked on the long-term tree swallow system. And I specialized in gut microbiomes and stress physiology in tree swallows. So then graduated with my PhD, and then always knew I wanted to end up back in Pennsylvania. And the timing of a retirement was perfect for when I was finishing grad school, and then landed my dream job at Allegheny College, where my lab broadly studies integrative organismal biology, but we still specialize in cavity nesting birds. I also am the faculty advisor of the Bird Club. So like my bio mentioned, I really enjoy not only doing research on birds, but also using birds as a way to connect people with nature. So the Bird Club and I, this is what my garage looked like at one point, where we built over 150 nest boxes. And then we distributed them throughout the community, specifically targeting elementary schools where you can have kids color on the outside of the boxes and then use those again as a focal point to try and connect people with nature. So that's all I say about my background, and now we'll get into the star of the show. So again, throughout my PhD, I had the privilege to study a long-term population of tree swallows. And Tree swallows are cavity nesters, which means that you can put up a bird box like the one here on the right, and they will reliably nest inside of it. And for any kind of experimental biologist, cavity nesting birds are awesome because you know where the nests are going to be. You're not out in the forest looking for open cup nesters. And you can also do experiments, especially with the nestlings that are confined to the nest box. And they also are really tolerant species. You can catch a female tree swallow 4 different times throughout the breeding season, and she'll continuously come back to the nest. So besides the fact that they're beautiful and birdie tolerant of humans catching them, why should we even be concerned about stress levels in tree swallows? And tree swallows are part of a larger group of birds called aerial insectivores, and these are birds that exclusively eat on flying insects. And we know that aerial insectivores as a group are declining due to a variety of different things, but partly due to different changes in global temperatures as well. So this is a really impactful study that came out of the Lab of Ornithology that shows that we have lost over 3.2 billion birds in the past 50 years. So we're at an unprecedented rate of avian biodiversity loss. And you can see here that swallows, nightjars, and swifts are part of that aerial insectivore group that is seen to be declining. So we're using tree swallows as a model organism to kind of understand why aerial insectivores in general may be declining as a group. So one of the most important decisions that a bird can make is, especially if they're a migratory species, is when should they start breeding? So here we're going to ask the question, when should tree swallows start breeding? And it may make sense for a bird that if the incubation period is around 14 days, and that's a pretty set trait across individuals, there's a little bit of variation. But it may make sense then for the adults to migrate back and lay eggs that then once they hatch, it times up with peak insect emergence. And again, tree swallows are aerial insectivores, which means that the adults are feeding themselves with insects, and this is what they feed their chicks. But birds and insects use different environmental cues to time their emergences or reproduction. So birds use day length. That's why as the spring approaches and day length starts to increases, you'll hear birds singing and they're migrating back. So as days lengthen, they see that as a cue to start breeding. But insects are something what we call ectotherms, which means that they rely on the external temperature to determine what their internal temperature is. So if insects are using temperature, a broad trend that we're seeing is that springs are warming earlier in general. So it could be that if global temperatures are rising, that the insect emergence could occur earlier in the spring. And then what happens is if the tree swallow continues to lay their eggs at the same time each year, again, we have this warming springs or shifting insect emergences earlier in the season. If the birds are still using photoperiod, which is not changing over time, then we can have a circumstance like this where the chicks are going to hatch after the peak insect emergence, and then we can get a situation like this. So the question then becomes, and a lot of scientists are studying this right now, is how are birds responding, or are they at all? And a really powerful thing about this long-term system that I worked on during my PhD was that we have years and years, 30 years worth of data. And what we find, and this is breeding female tree swallows in this figure here. And on the x-axis, you'll see that it's the average week of the first egg laid. And then on the y-axis is lifetime number of fledglings. Fledglings are baby birds that successfully leave the nest. And Again, we can catch the same individuals year to year, so we can actually get their lifetime number of fledglings produced at our field site. And you see that tree swallows that breed earlier, they have a higher number of lifetime fledglings. So if you are breeding as early as possible, you perhaps are keeping up with these earlier insect emergences, and then you're able to fledge more young. But the problem is that on average, temperatures are rising, but living in Ithaca, New York for 5 years, and now in Northwest Pennsylvania, I know that snow is a possibility the whole way through May. So if the birds are coming back earlier and we have these extreme weather events that are also associated with warming climates, this means that earlier lay dates are putting both adult birds and their nestlings at greater risk of experiencing cold snaps. And again, we can use data from the long-term population to answer this question. So this is a figure that shows the hatch dates of tree swallows, and that from 1972, they've advanced about 3 days per decade. So, and then when you couple that with the effects of cold snaps on nestlings, you find that their likelihood of having a detrimental cold snap has almost doubled due to them hatching earlier and having an increased chance of experiencing a detrimental cold snap. And if anyone has ever seen a hatchling tree swallow, they're an altricial species, which means that they hatch and they have no feathers, their eyes are closed, and they are completely reliant on both the external temperature and that temperature regulation by the parents. But as temperatures drop, they're not only dealing with increased thermoregulatory cost, but also their insect prey goes away because you don't see insects when it's cold. So we're dealing with a two-sided effect here of both it decreases their food availability, so the parents might then fly off and prioritize themselves, and is increasing the thermoregulatory cost of the chicks. So if anyone here has ever been driving in a car or in a car with someone and you or someone else almost rear end someone, you slam on the brakes and you feel that rush of adrenaline. So that's your fight or flight response. And the way that humans and birds and a lot of other animals respond to stress is very similar. So there is stress hormones that flood through the body, and the whole point of those hormones is to change metabolism and energy distribution to deal with a stressful event. So in humans, it's cortisol, but in birds, it's a slight variant of the molecule called corticosterone. So I'm going to abbreviate it by calling it CORT. But we know that across the animal kingdom, that mounting a hormonal stress response, again, redistributes energy to help deal with the stressor. So we wanted to ask, and this was a central part of my dissertation at Cornell, but do adult and nestling tree swallows, do they even hormonally respond to cold? Do they register it as a stressor? So that's the question we're going to explore. So I designed a really complex experimental design where I created something called an ice attic, because when I explored if I could buy mini air conditioning units, it was way too expensive. So this right here is just, the arrow is pointing to the actual nest box that has the nest in it. And then we took the roof off and we put another nest box on top that has a grate, and then we shoved it full of ice packs. And then we controlled for condensation by placing paper towels around it. And then we also were able to track the internal temperature that the birds are experiencing with this little pendant temperature logger called a hobo. And we put that right at the level of where the nest was, so that we could see, okay, all of this cold, is it successfully making its way down into the actual nest box to change the internal temperature that the tree swallows are experiencing. So to actually register something as a stressor, you have to experience it. So what we did here was we exposed the tree swallows to experimental cooling. And we did this when the nestlings were 4 to 6 days old. It was a 3-day cold snap is what we tried to simulate. And this part of nestling development in tree swallows, they're starting to feather in and their growth rate really starts to ramp up. We didn't want to do it too early, so that's why we chose this nestling day 4 to 6. And this was constant ice packs through this entire time to try and simulate a real acute cold snap. So half of the individuals, which was 19 different boxes. So you'll see here I have the number of females plus the total number of nestlings that were distributed across those boxes. So half of them got the ice attic with the frozen ice packs. And then the other half, we still put ice packs in, but they weren't frozen because these ice packs had to be swapped every 3 hours for 15 hours a day. So that's a lot of disturbance at the nest box. So for our controls, they also had an ice attic, but it was just full of room temperature ice packs that we still swapped out at the same frequency because we're dealing with stress hormones here. So we let them experience that for 3 days. And then we gave all the boxes an acute cold snap, a secondary cold snap. So if you experience cold, or when you experience it again, are you going to mount a hormonal stress response that maybe will change your thermoregulation and your metabolism in ways that help you survive or make you better equipped for that secondary cold snap? So we did that on nestling day 12 because at this point they're fully feathered in. And yeah, we just wanted to test it later on in development once they're kind of thermoregulating on their own. So that acute cold snap then was for 6 hours. And then what we did was right after we did that secondary cold snap, we caught the female inside of the box when she was flying in to go feed the nestlings. And we also then took blood samples from the nestlings as well. So again, the stress hormone here, we're going to abbreviate as CORT. So hormones travel through the blood. So you can take a blood sample from a bird. If my arm was a wing, they have a vein called the brachial vein that runs right across their elbow. And you can take a tiny bit of blood and then you clot it with a cotton ball, and then they can fly right off. So it's doing no harm to the birds. And that's a way for us to sample their stress hormones immediately after they experience that secondary cold snap. So then the question becomes, how do you actually measure stress hormones? And what we can do is there's something called a stress curve. And over time, if the bird is not experiencing stress, it is at a baseline level. And this is the same in humans as well. We do have a certain amount of cortisol that courses through our blood at all times. It's not something that's only released in response to a stressor, but it's at very low levels that mediate everyday metabolic processes. But then when a disturbance happens, like a cold snap or being chased by a predator or slamming on the brakes of your car, that sends a signal to the brain that then starts this hormonal cascade that goes the whole way down to the adrenal glands. And those are glands that sit right on top of your kidneys. And that is where stress hormones are produced from. So then what happens is once the adrenal glands get the signal that there's a stressor, they will increase production of CORT. And then it starts to ramp up and course through the blood and make it to other things. If anyone has ever had an anxiety attack or something like that, or you've been super stressed out, you may notice that things like your heart starts to beat faster, your lungs are trying to expand more. You may feel really flushed and hot because blood is rushing to the surface of your skin. But Eventually, the stress hormone is at such a high level that we can take a blood sample at the top of that curve. It's about 30 minutes after the start of a disturbance. And you can take a blood sample at the top of that curve, and this is what we call stress-induced corticosterone, but it basically is the maximum amount of stress hormone that an animal is putting out into the bloodstream. And then eventually, right, and again, the whole point of that is to increase metabolism to deal with that stressor. And then eventually, what we hope is that that curve is going to come back down, so that we're coming back down to baseline levels, because when an animal stays at the top of this curve, that's when you start to see chronic stress symptoms. Okay. Oh, I gave away my joke. Okay. I was terrified that the undergraduate field assistants were not going to come back after the first day of this experiment, because again, these ice packs had to be swapped every 3 hours for 15 hours a day. And we were doing over 60 boxes of this experiment. So my first fear was that they weren't going to come back, but then day 2 they did. And then my second fear was that all of that effort wasn't actually going to significantly lower the internal nest box temperature enough to be perceivable to the tree swallow. So when I ran these data, it was terrifying. But we did successfully lower the internal nest box temperature by about 5.1 degrees Celsius. So here in all of my slides now, the cooled boxes, the ones that have the frozen ice packs, are going to be in purple. And then the controls are in orange to signal that those are just at ambient temperature, or the temperature outside of the box. Yep, and we thankfully successfully decreased the internal nest box temp by 5 degrees Celsius, which is putting them right at the threshold of where a natural cold snap would be in terms of temperature. Okay, so now we get to reveal the results. Okay. So first, we'll look at the effect of cold on the adult females. And when you're mounting a hormonal stress response, you can look at two things. You can look at how high does the peak go, like how much stress hormone is being produced in the blood. And you can also look at how soon do they reach that peak stress-induced level. So here on the x-axis, we have sampling latency. And then on the y-axis, we have corticosterone, or the stress hormone in the blood. And what we did was we took blood samples from females at all different times so that we could get a span from 0 to 60 minutes. And what we're finding is that the ones that had experienced cold before, that they not only respond stronger, you can see here that the purple line right here at the stress induced is much, much higher than that of the orange, or the control boxes. But also we can look to see how many minutes does it take for them to reach their stress-induced levels, or to max out of their stress hormones. And so not only, again, do the adult females have a stronger stress response, but they also reach their peak levels in 22 minutes, versus the control boxes in orange reach theirs within 26. So it's helping them in two different ways. They're responding more strongly and more sooner. Okay, so what about the nestlings? And nestlings also perceive it as cold, or cold as a stressor. So here the colors are slightly different. They're from two different papers. But again, here on the x-axis, we have nestling day. And then on the y-axis, again, we have corticosterone, or that stress hormone. And on day 10, we took a blood sample at ambient temperature to assess if it's just regular temperature outside, are the cold ones just having higher stress to begin with. But then on day 12, again, that was during the time of that secondary acute cold snap. So they had experienced cold from days 4 to 6 of their development. And then on day 12, we gave all individuals a secondary cold snap. And those ones that had been cooled earlier in nestling development responded stronger than the controls during that secondary cold snap. So we're seeing it both at the nestling level and at the adult level as well. So to kind of wrap up, what we found is that our initial question was, are tree swallows even perceiving cold as a stressor? And if they experience cold at one point and then they experience it again, can they successfully mount a hormonal stress response that may allow them to redistribute energy to deal with it? And we did. We found it at both life stages. We found that cold exposure can induce a hormonal stress response in adult females and as day 12 nestlings. And we've done a lot of other work trying to link, if you have a high stress response, what does that mean for your survival and for your reproductive success? And from our long-term population, we know that in adult females, if they generally have a higher hormonal stress response, it oftentimes supports reproductive success. They're able to deal with stressors better if you can mount a higher stress response. Because sometimes if you were to keep those levels really high, it may become detrimental. But we find that the adult females are able to both mount a stronger response and then actually turn it off quicker. The process of turning off a stress response is called negative feedback, but it basically allows your system, once you deal with the stressor, you don't want those stress hormones to continue to redistribute energy. So then the body tells the brain that you're no longer stressed and your hormones come back down. So we're also finding some links with fitness as well. So as a kind of a wrapping a conclusion around the research section of the talk, stress hormones allow tree swallows to respond quickly to changing environments. And here we're specifically testing cold temperatures. And since we found that both it happens in nestlings and adults, some other work from our long-term population also shows that it's a genetic trait, that it is actually heritable. So whatever the stress hormones are in the parents tends to be reflected in the nestlings as well. So this graphic is just to show that even nestlings can experience changes in their hormone levels that then may stay that way as through adulthood. And then they'll continue to pass those stress resilient genes to the next generation of nestlings. And then eventually you build up and get population level responses to changing environments. And there's this really sad picture of these roosting tree swallows that are covered in snow. And again, temperatures are warming on average, but another effect of this is that we're seeing more temperature extremes. So these are things like heat waves and cold snaps, depending on what latitude you live in. Okay, so one way that we could help tree swallows or cavity nesters in general is by providing habitat to them. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk generally about what can you do in your own backyard to help cavity nesting birds. So when we say the word cavity, before birds had access to human-made cavities, they nested in natural cavities in trees. So oftentimes, these were old woodpecker holes or different or dead trees that got holes in them somehow. And what happens then is that if there is habitat destruction or deforestation, you're removing those natural cavities. So some cavity nesting species like purple martins, which are depicted here, if anyone's ever seen these white gourds, those are specifically for purple martin colonies. And some cavity nesting species are almost completely reliant on artificial cavities now, made by humans. So that's why it's so important that we provide bird boxes in our own backyards or in other ecosystems. So I'm going to put my professor hat on here for a second, and I'd like people to participate either by unmuting yourself or putting something in the chat. But if you were designing a bird box, here we're going to call them nest boxes. What are some factors that you should take into consideration when designing? So here I'm thinking about things like size and things like that.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is about you want the hole to be appropriate for the size of the body of the creature you want to nest there.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really important one. Anyone else?
How about an air vent?
Yes.
I mean, you have the hole for air vent, but do they need a little more air?
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I'll touch on ventilation a little bit later.
And in the chat, Will says insulation.
Yes. Yeah. So also like the type of material that you use to make the box. One could be a really good insulator and another couldn't. Okay, thank you so much. I'm so used to working with college age students who really don't want to participate, so that's fantastic.
Yeah, Barbara also throws in some sort of protection from predators.
Ah, fantastic. Yes. Predator guards. So yeah, I'll touch on all of these. Thank you for contributing. So again, these are some of the things that we think about when we're constructing bird boxes. So the material used, the size of the entrance hole, are there invasive species that could get in, predators, ventilation, the location of where you place the box, and then also how often should you open it up and check it. Okay, so I went into Google and I typed in nest box material, and sometimes birds are not very picky about where they nest. So I found, like, for example, an old flower pot, water bottles, corks, Legos. Legos would be super cool, but that'd be super expensive if you have more than one box in your backyard. But when we're thinking about materials, oftentimes we're using wood. But one, we want to think about cost. For example, my field site is about a half hour south of where the college is at. It's at MK Goddard State Park, and they have over 100 bird boxes. So wood is oftentimes a really good option. Also thinking about durability and weather. A lot of, like, the birds are really only using them for reproductive purposes in the spring and summer, but then they will stay there through the winter time. So you're seeing a lot of different, like, contracting depending on the temperature. And then also the effect on the birds. If the nestlings are stuck inside of that bird box for up to 20 some days or 30 some days, depending on the species, then you want to think about, okay, what color is it? Is the wood absorbing a lot of heat? Is it insulating them from cold? Things like that. So Joe brought up entrance hole size. So if you were to go online and buy a bluebird box, typically it's about 1.5 inches in diameter. And typically one of these boxes, this is the standard size that you see for a backyard bird box. This will allow anything from a house wren, a tree swallow, a bluebird, a chickadee, but it excludes things like starlings. But something like an American kestrel, which is a cavity nesting falcon species, would not be able to fit inside of here. So kestrel boxes have a much wider entrance hole. And you can oftentimes actually buy different disc that you can put into an existing entrance hole and actually change or tighten the entrance hole. But typically we're looking for about 1.5 inches. Yes, and then someone mentioned predators. So again, it's really good for bird watchers and for researchers that we can find the boxes. We can easily know that where the boxes are. But that also means that predators, once they key into there being birds in the box, then they'll just keep coming back and back. So thinking about ground predators, you can put, we call these baffles, but you can put ones out that make a little cone shape. You can also, I've seen people put PVC pipe onto the poles that prevents things from crawling up. Sometimes it prevents snakes, sometimes it doesn't. But just thinking about ground predators, the top predator of tree swallows at my field sites have been minks. So just thinking about ways of keeping ground predators off. But then, of course, we know that there are aerial predators as well. So you can sometimes put cages on the outside of the boxes so that something that lands on top can't actually reach in and grab the nestlings. No one has ever guessed ventilation. That was so exciting when someone guessed ventilation. So yeah, the entrance hole itself will provide some, but this is the design of bird box that I use. So you'll see that the roof is kind of slanted. So there are air vents up top. But then I also will cut off the edges of the floor. And then this also allows one, ventilation, but also if for some reason there was heavy rain and there's tons of water flying in either through the roof or through the entrance hole, that way it can actually drain out through the sides. But again, there's no one perfect bird box. You'll see variants of ventilation, but as long as they have some, because wood can heat up pretty good, and then you don't want them, getting too hot inside. So I typically use rough cut pine to make my bird boxes, but there are other wood alternatives that you could use. And then think about location too. This is very species dependent. So also thinking about, is the bird species of interest? If you're trying to attract tree swallows, for example, they are a semi-colonial species, which means that they actually like having other tree swallows around. But it can't be too close or else they start decking it out for what they deem to be the best nest box. So that's oftentimes why some people will put a box on one side and then a box on the other side of a pole, because if a bluebird's there, that way the tree swallow also has habitat and then they don't fight for a single nest box. But thinking about if you want more than one bird box in your backyard, either spacing them really far apart, depending on the species you're trying to attract, if they're a solitary species, or if you want them clustered together for these semi-colonial species. Also thinking about what do they eat. So having, especially for aerial insectivores, they love bodies of water. That's why you'll see tree swallows soaring over ponds or lakes. And if you put a nest box right beside a body of water, you're most likely going to get a tree swallow, versus if you put a box right at the edge of a tree line, you're probably going to get chickadees and house wrens because they have access to sticks and it's really close to their natural habitat. And then also thinking about, is the species generally tolerant of disturbance? So for example, if you were to put a nest box in your backyard that has a floodlight right above it, it might actually deter the species from nesting if they deem that there's too much light pollution. Or thinking about putting a nest box right beside a road. If there's too many cars driving past, there could be too much noise pollution for the species. But there are two invasive bird species that are cavity nesters. So house sparrows and European starlings are two species that are very, very tolerant of disturbance. That's why they're so successful about invading and taking up the habitat. So with the standard nest box of 1.5 inch entrance hole, you prevent starlings from going in, but house sparrows can still get in. So oftentimes people may get, especially if you're in a residential area, or an urban area, you may get house sparrows, and they are persistent. Those males will keep bringing nesting material in. So again, you can either put a cage on the front. Sometimes if you extend the front of the box, it deters them for some reason. But just be wary that if you're putting it near places of disturbance, you're more likely to get an invasive species rather than a native species. This is being recorded, so hopefully everyone will have access to this. But if you're ever wondering what species is in my bird box, you can usually tell just by the nesting material that's being used, even if there's not any eggs yet. So bluebirds are really, really neat. Their nest cup will almost always be right in the center. They use straw and grass, especially pine needles. And then they have that characteristic blue egg. But I actually have been having some bluebirds lay white eggs. So be wary that if you find a really big white egg and you're like, what happened to that tree swallow? It's probably a bluebird. Chickadees use moss and fur. So if you find a moss bed, it most likely is a chickadee. Depending on what area of Pennsylvania you're in, it could be a black-capped, or it could be a Carolina. We're like right on the hybrid zone. They're slowly edging their way up. So we're just going to use the word chickadee. Tree swallows, the thing to look for is it's a little bit messier in terms of where the grass is laid. And their characteristic is lining their nest cup with feathers. So if you find feathers in there, it's most likely a tree swallow. And they lay tiny white eggs. House wrens are also super easy to spot because they fill the bird box to the brim with sticks. And then they somehow get in there and then they lay their eggs. And then it's a little hard to, especially in the early stages of nesting, to determine if it's a house sparrow, because really bluebird, tree swallow, and house sparrow nests look very similar at the early stages of nest construction. But house sparrows build a dome within the bird box. So if you get in there and there's nesting material that goes up across and it looks, you can't really find the nest cup, it's most likely a house sparrow. And they'll also use any trash. I found candy wrappers, fishing line, that they'll use straw and grass, trash, and then they also will just put feathers everywhere. They don't necessarily line the nest cup. So if it looks super messy and it's a dome, it's a house sparrow. And then the last thing that I'd like to touch on is if you do have a bird box, what's the appropriate way to monitor it, right? Like it's exciting to have a bird box that you can open it up and maybe assess what kind of a bird is in there. So the first thing to do is learn about the species ecology. So knowing what types of cavity nesters are around would be helpful. Fun facts about birds is that they typically only lay one egg a day. They don't lay all 5 eggs at once. So if you go into the box and you find an egg and then the next day you come back and find another, that's probably a signal that you should stay away from the box for a while, because birds are really temperamental when they're starting to lay eggs. Choosing safe times to visit the nest, so avoiding bad weather, especially if it's raining sideways. Also not checking the bird boxes first thing in the morning or after dusk, because birds lay their eggs in the morning. And then after dusk, they may be flying back in to brood over, or to incubate eggs or to brood over top of the nestlings. And then also avoiding the first few days of incubation, because this is when the birds are more prone to abandoning their nest if they perceive that there's a predator around. Being wary of nest predators, cats, crows, and blue jays are super smart. And if they follow you and you don't know it, then they know exactly where to go to get a tasty snack. Minimize disturbance at the box. If you're gonna go check it, make it quick. Don't stay there and kind of scare the birds. It is totally fine and legal to open up a box and to look and assess what nesting material is there, if you find eggs or nestlings, but to actually handle birds or eggs, you have to have permits. So for example, I have permits from the Game Commission, the Federal Banding Lab through USGS. I have permissions through Allegheny. I have a permission from the state parks, things like that. So totally fine to go out and check it. But to actually touch the eggs or the birds, you need permits. And then finally, also don't leave a dead end trail. If you put up a bird box in a field or in a place that has high grass, and you're constantly taking the same trail and you're pushing down that grass with your feet, kind of how you can tell where deer go through the edge of a forest, you are creating a perfect trail for predators to go and follow. So thinking about different ways to walk up to the bird box to avoid that. So with that, hopefully those are some useful tips for how to attract and help cavity nesting birds in your own backyard. So thank you so much for listening, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you, Jen. I'm sure if we were in person, you would hear our little clapping. For the questions, I wanted to kick it off with one that Nick put in the chat back when you were talking about your research. It may be helpful if you explained a little bit about how your control and comparison groups help to deal with you know, there's stress created by handling the fledglings and replacement of the ice packs and just being up in their space and all that work. Um, how do you differentiate um, the cold temperature stress versus the stress that comes from the experimental procedures?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you are right where even just catching a bird will initiate a stress response, or picking them up because they perhaps perceive us as a predator. So for example, if I ever want to get baseline levels, I actually have to get a blood sample within 3 minutes of picking them up, because that's how long it takes them to increase their stress hormone levels. But the way that we were actually able to say, like, it is the cold causing the stress is because we treated the control and the cold treated birds the exact same way, except the fact that the cold birds had frozen ice packs, and then the control birds had unfrozen ice packs. So even down to when we would go swap the ice packs every 3 hours, we also swapped the control boxes with other unfrozen ice packs. So we were equalizing disturbance at the box, and then we also were picking them up and catching the adults at the same rate, where the only thing that is different is, are the ice packs frozen or are they not?
Elegant.
I have a question. I don't know if you addressed this. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
can.
yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead,
Okay,
Lois.
great. The question is, so that they get cold and they respond to the cold the second time that they're stressed out. They respond better than birds that weren't subject to the initial stress.
Yep, that's
And
right.
and if that's so, then how does that affect when, if they're nesting earlier, so they might get this cold stress, and but the bugs are not there yet, so it's a double whammy. Is
Yeah.
that what you're saying?
Yeah. So what we tend to find, and here this is just generally if we're not even talking about cold specific stressors, but
Mm-hmm.
the individuals that come back and breed the earliest uh,
Mm-hmm.
are oftentimes the highest quality individuals, uh,
Oh.
which means that they often get first pick of the bird boxes. They And also, and we've seen this in our population, but the females and the males that come back sooner often are the most stress resilient as well. So you're totally right where they're coming back earlier, and that is going to put them at an increased risk of experiencing a cold snap. But they're already the really stress tolerant birds. So really it's just reinforcing if they can make it through the first cold snap of when they get back on their breeding grounds, then they can continue to breed earlier than the other ones, because then they can withstand the next cold snap.
Well, that was cool, very interesting. And the description of the house sparrow as a dome. Yeah. So I don't have to go in there and look for the eggs anymore. I can just say, okay, it's a house sparrow. Like I go down there because I watch nest boxes, but you can remove a house sparrow. I guess I don't know about starlings, but house sparrow, it's an invasive species, so you can.
Yep. Yeah, house sparrows are not protected under any of those permits that I talked about. So one of the best ways to deter them is if you get in there. I mean, it's the males
Oh,
keep coming back. Even if you pull the nesting material out, they'll still come back.
I just threw one out yesterday because I've had a bluebird box successfully with bluebirds for 20 years. And
Oh.
then this last year, 2 years already, house sparrows got in there and my bluebirds didn't come back the next year. And do you think they will ever come back to my box?
Oh, it's hard to say. I mean,
Oh, I'd be so sad.
yeah, I know that I've just started studying bluebirds the past 2 years. I know that tree swallows tend to be pretty, we call it site faithful, where once they breed in an area one year, the
Yeah.
adults tend to come back year after year,
hmm
which may be the case in bluebirds. So I would say like stick at it, and hopefully either a new pair stumbles upon your box or the old ones may come back and check it again.
Okay, I'll
That's
be
hard to say.
patient. Thank you very much.
Of course.
So I'm not sure if I can phrase a succinct question, but I'm thinking about the issue of over historical time periods, tree swallows have been facing cold snaps repeatedly over lots of periods of time. There have been, particularly cold, mini ice ages and so on. There have been periodic years and um like with ruffed grouse, we know that certain years when there's bad weather conditions during key breeding moments, that they have poor production that year. And then when it's good, they have a little bit of boom and bust that goes with that cycle, and there will be preferential selection in favor of resilience or at least able to survive. But it seems like particularly tricky when it comes to all the cortisol stuff because a part of the stress of cold is lack of insects and the calories that are needed. Treating that as a stressor with court is going to raise your metabolism, increase your metabolic rate, make you starve out faster, unless you're investing that elevated metabolism in successful foraging, which may or may not be plausible depending on how cold it actually is. I don't have a question, but I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things trying to explain these results was like we are changing the internal nest box temperature, but we weren't able to change food availability for example. So it's hard to say whether they perceive that there was less food because it was cold inside their box, but then they were confused once they went out and found insects. So one way that we're trying to address this is that there was another PhD student that was working with me on this project and amongst a variety of other people that made us successful. But her name's Jenny Euling, but she does diet metabarcoding of fecal samples. So something that we're exploring still is that we have fecal samples from a lot of these adults and nestlings. And then we can actually we can look at DNA from the insects and we can tell, are they changing their diets in response to like pre and post cold snap? So that's something that we're exploring. We also put up, we collaborate with a researcher named Peter Dunn, and we put up something called malaise traps, which basically look like big tents, and they have a bottle of alcohol on the top. And that's a way for us, and they catch insects. The insects fly up into the tent and then they get preserved in the ethanol. So we're looking at the fecal samples to see what the birds are actually eating. And then we have malaise trap data to look at if there's a natural cold snap, how does it change over time?
Cool. Cool in more than one way.
Yeah.
Awesome. Barring any other questions coming out, thanks so much. We'll put the recording out for others who weren't able to make it today, and I'm so grateful. I learned a ton, and I think, you know, the connection between backyard habitat and the broader things that the birds are experiencing, and just the general trend towards caring about birds' lives and understanding what they're going through is just becoming, you know, science has come so far, and doing this kind of really interesting behavioral work. Like I really admire what you're doing, and thanks so much for sharing it with us.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, thank you everyone for listening and for your great questions as well.
Super. Thanks a lot. Okay, take care, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it.
Yep. Bye, Jen.